Welcome back. In this video, I wanted to tell you a little bit about energy generation, storage, and recovery in cells. So we get energy by eating food, and when we eat food, it breaks down into three classes of molecules. The first is fat, the second is protein, and the third is carbohydrates. So carbohydrates is what I want to spend a little time talking about in this video because they are the main source of energy. Your body, of course, can also convert fat into energy. It's actually a very efficient way to store energy, and protein can even be converted into energy under certain circumstances. So when we eat carbohydrates, when we eat food that's broken down into carbohydrates, these carbohydrates enter the digestive tract, or your intestines, and the intestines are lined with lots of blood vessels, and that's where your body absorbs all the nutrients that you've eaten. Once the carbohydrates are absorbed by your digestive tract, they go into your bloodstream where they are transported to the liver. And in the liver, they are converted from carbohydrates into glucose. So glucose is the fundamental, is sort of the most basic form of sugar that your body can use. Its formula is C6H12O6. And this is the main form of energy that your body makes use of. So even though glucose is what is converted to by the body, this is not actually what the cell uses for energy. The cell uses a different molecule called ATP. And ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate is called adenosine triphosphate because it has an adenosine group with three phosphate molecules attached to the side of the sugar. And this is the molecule that does all of the work and powers the cell. This is essentially the rechargeable battery of the cell. And this particular molecule is converted back and forth from ATP, adenosine triphosphate, to ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. And so the way this molecule releases energy is that the cell will break off, or a molecule will break off one of these phosphate groups, releasing a tremendous amount of energy. The energy liberated by breaking this bond is used to power all sorts of chemical reactions within the cell. Once the molecule is converted to ADP, it's then recycled in the body within an organism known as the mitochondria, an organelle within the cell, mitochondria. And the mitochondria, part of the mitochondria's job is to create energy within the cell, and the ADP molecule is essentially recharged or reassembled by adding a phosphate group back to it, and it becomes ATP once again. So this endless cycle goes on, and this is what gives cells ultimately their energy. All right, so what are the sorts of things that ATP is used for, and how exactly does it power things in the body and the cells? Well, most often it's used to make proteins do something. So oftentimes proteins will have a particular spot that an ADP molecule can attach to and then power that protein to change shape or perform a chemical reaction. So each time a protein changes shape to do muscle contraction, an ATP molecule is consumed and converted to ADP. Each time your cell performs certain classes of chemical reactions, converting substrates into products, an ATP molecule is formed into ADP. Even things like DNA replication, making copies of DNA, uses molecules that require ATP to function. And the ATP literally plugs into it just like a battery plugs into a portable electronic device. So the question then is, how do you get from glucose to ATP? How does the cell take the food that you eat and turn it into the useful currency of the cell, ATP? That is done with a process known as cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is the generic term for taking glucose molecules and turning them into ATP, fully recharging ATP. So one molecule of glucose will yield up to 38 ATP molecules within the body, within the cell. And here's how it works. So GLU is your glucose molecule. So a glucose molecule will come across the cell wall from outside the cell to inside the cell by transport through the bloodstream, for instance. And once the glucose is inside the body, it essentially becomes trapped and it's funneled through a series of reactions that create the ATP. The process of cellular respiration is fairly complex, so I've represented it as sort of a systems diagram here to try and simplify things. So there's three major reactions that occur, or groups of reactions. The first is called glycolysis. And glycolysis takes the one glucose molecule and two ADPs that have already been spent and converted from ATP, and through a series of chemical reactions, it produces several outputs. One of the outputs is pyruvic acid, 2 molecules of pyruvic acid, 2 ATP molecules, and 4 hydrogen ions. Right? So that's the output from glycolysis. And then what happens is the pyruvic acid molecules are transported into the organelle I just told you about, the mitochondria. So these purple dashed lines represent the cell, the wall of the mitochondria within the cell. So after the pyruvic acid is transported across the wall into the mitochondrial matrix, and it is converted into another intermediate molecule called acetyl-CoA. And acetyl-CoA produces 4 more hydrogen ions, and it also produces some carbon dioxide. It produces 2 acetyl-CoA molecules, which then go to the Krebs cycle. So the Krebs cycle is the second major series of chemical reactions that are used to produce energy. The Krebs cycle is also known as the citric acid cycle. And this is probably the most famous or most common series of reactions that you learn about in high school biology and so forth. The Krebs cycle will take these 2 acetyl-CoA molecules, 6 water molecules, and 2 more ADP molecules, and then it will convert them into a variety of outputs. It creates 4 carbon dioxides, 16 hydrogens, and 2 recharged ATPs. So if you're keeping track of this, you'll notice that so far I've generated 2 ATPs here and 2 ATPs here. So I've got 4 ATPs just from glycolysis and from the Krebs cycle. So the vast majority of my ATP molecules come from this third series of reactions known as oxidative phosphorylation. And oxidative phosphorylation uses the hydrogen atoms produced in glycolysis here and here. It uses those atoms to essentially recharge all of the ADP molecules to ATPs. So from oxidative phosphorylation, I get by far the vast majority of my energy production. And essentially, this stage of the reaction uses electron shuttling to recharge ADPs into ATPs. So at a very fundamental level, this is almost like a battery in the sense that electrons are being used to recharge the energy molecules. And so after I've gone through all of these reactions, my glucose molecule has yielded a total of 34 plus 4 ATP molecules. All right, so that's how glucose is converted to ATP. Now, what happens if we have too much glucose, or if we don't need the glucose that we currently have? Well, at any given time, you have a certain concentration of ATP that your body needs in order to function. So let's call this ideal ATP concentration. And then there's a feedback loop within the body, within the cell, within glycolysis, that essentially senses ATP concentration. So we have our actual ATP concentration. This is the concentration that's present inside the cell. And we have some set point ATP concentration, an ideal concentration that we would like to maintain. And so glycolysis essentially is a negative feedback loop that prevents this, that allows the cell to control how much ATP is being produced. And in this way, the cell can control the rate at which glucose is converted. So say you still have lots of glucose and you don't actually need a lot of ATPs at any given time. What happens to the glucose? Well, your body will store glucose in a special polymer. It will start to string the glucose molecules together one by one in a polymer called glycogen. And this process is called glycogenesis. And it allows the cell to store molecules and retrieve them as needed. And it stores them in a very interesting way. So it creates branched polymer chains. Each one of these tiny assemblies is a glucose molecule. And the cell can basically thread and string on glucose molecules, as many as needed, in order to store the glucose. And then whenever glucose is needed, it uses a process called glycogenolysis to retrieve the glucose molecules, literally to chop them off and use them one by one. And there's a protein required in the center here that acts as sort of the seed molecule to grow all of these polymer chains off of. And that's how your body stores glucose as glycogen. So this concludes this brief video on how cells store, generate, and retrieve energy.